The song of the voiceless one. There was a God who stopped singing, not gradually, not by accident, deliberately. And the moment they did, the world began to forget them. We don't know their name. But what happened after? What's still happening? That part matters. Especially if you're listening alone. In the beginning, when the world was still finding its shape, the gods had a way of being known. Each one had a song. The sky god's voice was deep and constant. In every storm, every wind, the sea goddess sang in wavelengths so old they predated memory. The grain god's hum was the sound of soil coming alive each spring. These were not metaphors. They held the world together. Mortals listened. They built temples. They organized their lives around divine melody. Children learned to sing before they learned to speak. Music was proof that the gods existed. But there was one god who refused. While others sang, they listened. While the pantheon poured their essence into sound, this god collected silence. Let it grow deeper, richer, more complex with each passing year. The other gods found this disturbing. "Why do you not sing?" the sky god asked once. His voice was impatient. The god who had become voiceless simply looked at him and said nothing. For centuries, this was tolerated. A quirk, an anomaly, but tolerance has limits. Around this time, in a village at the base of mountains, a child was born. Her name was Kaya. By age 7, she played the lute. By 12, she performed in temple festivals. By 15, she was becoming rare. A musician so attuned to divine melody that people said she could hear the gods themselves singing through her fingers. The priests loved her. The people came to listen. She was becoming essential. Then the fever came. It was swift. 3 days, and it left her changed. Her hands lost their coordination. Her voice emerged thin, barely audible even in silence. She could not sing the hymns. She could not project. Within months, the temple stopped asking her to perform. Within a year, people had stopped looking at her entirely. She became the girl who had lost her gift. Worse, a reminder of how fragile gifts could be. Kaya didn't leave the village, but she began to disappear. She would walk to the edges of settled places. She would listen, not to music. There was no music for her anymore, but to other things. The sound of wind through specific leaves. The way rain sounded different on stone versus soil. The particular quality of silence that came just before dawn. People found her unsettling. There was something about the way she listened that made them uncomfortable. As if by paying such close attention to quiet, she was revealing something about the world they didn't want to see. A merchant passed her once and hurried away. He later told his wife that he felt watched by her, but not in a threatening way, in a way that was worse, as if she had noticed something about him that he had never noticed about himself. 3 years later, Kaya found the temple. The temple was nearly invisible, built into a mountain few people visited, covered in moss. The doors didn't creak. They had settled so completely, they moved without sound. Inside, There was almost nothing. No statues, no offerings, no remnants of worship. Just empty stone and air that hadn't been disturbed in a very long time. Kaya sat in the center and closed her eyes, and that was when she heard it. Not a song, not words, but a presence so profound it was almost unbearable. A knowing that wasn't knowledge. A communication that required no language. The Voiceless One was there. When they spoke, and they did speak, though the sound came from inside her, their voice was like the space between heartbeats made audible. "You know how to listen," they said. Kaya nodded. "The others do not. They sing. They broadcast their existence and call it communication. But to listen, to truly listen, requires a different kind of courage. Silence. Your hands are broken. Your voice is ruined. The world has decided you are finished. The words should have hurt. Instead, they felt like recognition. But you understand now what those hands and voice were always meant to do. Not to make sound, but to receive it, to hold it, to let silence teach you what music never could. Kaya left the temple 3 days later. Something crucial had changed. She carried silence now, not as absence, as presence, a living thing. And everywhere she went, that silence began to spread. It started small. In the village where Kaya lived, people noticed that the birds sang less frequently. Not that they had died, but they seemed quieter, as if singing required more effort than it was worth. The children stopped their constant chatter. The priests, when they sang their hymns, found their voices wavering, not from weakness, but from a strange new awareness that their singing was drowning out something else, something underneath. Within 6 months, the daily temple music had diminished by half. Kaya began to walk. From settlement to settlement, mountain to mountain, she carried her quiet. She never preached. She never taught formally. She simply existed in a state of such profound listening that anyone near her began to do the same. The effect rippled outward. The great temples of the sky god found their congregations declining. The sea goddess's festivals drew fewer worshippers. The grain god's harvest celebrations were attended with less enthusiasm, not because people stopped believing, but because they had begun to hear what existed beyond the songs. They had begun to listen. The singing gods noticed, and they became afraid. Fear does not make divine beings reasonable. It makes them desperate. The sky god called the pantheon together, not in earthly temples, but in the spaces between worlds, in the places where gods negotiate the rules of existence. "Something is wrong," the sky god said. His voice was louder than it had ever been. "Our worshippers are abandoning the songs. They listen to nothing. It spreads like a disease." The sea goddess rippled with anxiety. "My temples are emptying. Families that have served for generations are staying away. They say my song is insufficient." The forge god, oldest among them, spoke more carefully. "There is a God moving through the world. One of ours. The one we thought we knew." The sky god's fury was ancient. "Find them. End this." problem was immediate. They could not find what was in hiding. The Voiceless One had become invisible to divine perception, not by hiding, but by existing outside the frequency where gods dwelled. The singing gods existed in a frequency of utterance, of performance, of projection. Silence existed elsewhere, so the sky god did what desperate gods do. He made his voice louder. His storms became more violent, his thunder more dramatic. He demanded that mortals return to singing, and he made the consequences clear. Drought, famine, disasters only his mercy could prevent. The other gods followed. The sea goddess's songs became shrill. The grain god's hum grew forced. They were all trying to drown out something that could not be drowned, and it was working. For a moment, mortals, frightened by divine wrath, returned to the temples. They sang louder, they prayed harder, but the damage was already done. Because once you have heard the silence underneath the songs, you cannot unhear it. The temples filled again, but the worship was hollow. The singing continued, but it was desperate now, angry, resentful, and through it all, Kaya walked. Kaya never claimed to be a messenger. She never organized a movement, never explained what was happening or why. She simply lived in a state of listening so complete that it transformed everyone around her. A merchant would pass her on the road and find his constant calculations of profit and loss falling silent. He would arrive confused, wondering why the need to accumulate had lost its urgency. A soldier would sit near her while resting and suddenly become aware of his own heartbeat. The constant assertion of dominance would seem unnecessary. A mother would watch Kaya listening to the wind and understand, for the first time, why her constant chatter at her children might be preventing them from knowing themselves. No one was healed. Everyone was changed. And as more people learned to listen, the gods' songs became increasingly desperate. The sky god descended to the mortal world. He had not done this in centuries. He moved through the lands with visible fury, demanding that priests explain why their prayers had become weak. But when he found Kaya, and he eventually did, he found something that shook him to his foundation. She was sitting in a field at dawn, absolutely still, and around her, the world was perfectly silent. Not the absence of sound, but a kind of hush that was almost alive. A silence so profound, it contained the potential for all possible songs, all possible music, all possible utterance. It was everything his voice had never managed to achieve. The sky god opened his mouth to speak, and for the first time in eons, he found himself unable to produce sound, not prevented, but aware that in the presence of such profound silence, speaking seemed wrong, violent even, like screaming in a cathedral. He left without saying anything. Within days, the other gods began to withdraw. They didn't abandon the world, but they became quieter, less insistent. They learned, slowly and painfully, that the loudness they had mistaken for power was actually a kind of weakness. The universe never needed them to sing to hold together. It never had. 20 years after Kaya first found the temple, the world was different. Music had not died, but it had changed. It was quieter now, more intentional. People sang less for the gods and more for each other. Less for performance and more for the simple act of being together in sound. The great temples were smaller, but they were also more genuine. The voiceless one had begun to fade. This was intentional. As more mortals learned to listen, to carry silence not as absence, but as presence, the God who had taught them had less need to exist separately. They were becoming one. The listeners and the listened to. The silence and those who dwelled within it. Kaya grew old. Her hands never healed. Her voice never recovered. But she became something far more important than the musician she had been. Near the end of her life, she climbed the mountain to the temple one final time. The temple was even less visible now. Nature was reclaiming it completely. In a few more generations, it would be indistinguishable from the mountain itself. She sat in the center of the empty stone chamber and closed her eyes. And in that moment, she heard something that might have been the voiceless one's presence, or might have been her own reflection, or might have been something so vast and distributed through the world that it had no center anymore. It said nothing. It never had. But in its silence, she heard something like gratitude. The temples are almost all gone now. The songs have faded into history. No one prays to the voiceless one anymore. Not because they've forgotten, not exactly, but because there's no need to pray to something that is everywhere, to something that exists in every moment of genuine listening, in every pause between words, in every night when you sit alone and the world goes quiet, and you become aware of the vast machinery of sound and silence that holds everything together. You know it. You feel it in moments when you're alone, late at night, listening to the almost silence around you. That sense that there is an attention paid to the world. A listening that is separate from all the noise and chatter. If you stop talking right now, if you turn off the sounds around you, if you let yourself settle into the quiet for just a moment, you might hear it too. You might feel that ancient, patient attention, the voiceless one, finally heard, not through sound, but through the space where all sound goes to rest. And you might wonder, as you lie awake in the darkness, is that God listening to me, or am I listening to myself? And is there any difference anymore